that Claire is exceptionally good at preparing people for this type of presentation. So she sent me the title, The 5 Ways Open Source is Critical to the Future of AI. When I first received that, I thought, wait a minute, what if I only think of 4 ways? What if there are 6? But I think 5 is a good number, so I endeavor to get through these 5 ways in which I think is critical. So, as Claire mentioned, I'm speaking in the role of being the executive director of something called the Open Forum for AI, or OFAI. This is an academic and nonprofit led initiative coming out of Carnegie Mellon with a few university partners, Georgia Tech, George Washington, the University of Texas, Austin, all through our open source programs offices, or OSPOs. We also have the Open Source Initiative. So full disclosure, I'm a board member of OSI, but I'm not speaking in that capacity on this talk. Creative Commons, the Atlantic Council, which is a policy think tank based in Washington, D.C., and a small nonprofit named Conscience, which is doing AI for drug discovery where there are market incentives don't exist. So the profit market is no way to get pharmaceutical companies to act. We also have individual fellows from the private and public sector, so individuals from Microsoft, GitHub, Cerebras, a venture finance group named VGB, and the CTO of the US Navy. And we're funded by Carnegie Mellon itself, but also 2 other venture finance groups, backed groups that have nonprofit wings called the Whittier Network and Noble Reach Foundation. And we are aiming to move towards human-centered AI, and to do that through open source and openness. You just heard, if you were in the room previously, you just heard the talk about the open source data definition. I'd encourage you to go take a look on the OSI's website. And fundamentally, it is an attempt to take the 4 freedoms that Karen talked about: use, study, modify, share, and apply them in the context of AI. So I will say that the definition has focused on the data. There are the reasons that were provided. You can't necessarily get all the data, but at least detailed information about it, the code, and the weights. So, and as you also heard, this is the version 1.0. The way I've described this in public forums is it's stable but not permanent. For the reasons you heard earlier, it was important to put some sort of benchmark out there for in a community-led process. It was a 2-year co-design effort, a global effort. But we understand that we need to revisit this definition and think about how it might evolve over time. So in that regard, for OFAI, it does represent an important foundation for us to think more broadly about openness in AI. And this is a tactical framework that we think we can develop with community engagement that focuses on that concept of openness, thinking about all aspects of it, all the way from the source code being open source to open governance, but mainly in terms of what are the impacts of something being open with AI, and what are the risks. There could be marginal risks, there could be basic types of risks as well. So you can think about it this way, that for example, Hugging Face has a lot of these boards looking at transparency of AI models. They're very helpful, very useful. But can I ask questions about how safe those models are? Can I ask questions about the lack of bias, or maybe not? The reproducibility of those models. So we want to get beyond what I don't mean disparagingly, I think it's an observation, the mechanical transactional aspects of what people are talking about when it comes to transparency of these models, to openness as a driver for answering those kinds of questions, and to thinking about the impact on innovation, and participation, and so on. I'm not really sure why that keeps happening. Do I have to look at it? And it's very important to think about the context in which openness occurs, the why, the who, the what, at what stage of an AI model, for what community, and for what purpose. So here are some of the 5 ways that I came up with where I think this kind of approach to open source and to openness is really critical to the trajectory of AI. And I'll go through each one of these and try to give you a reason or an example why I think that's the case. So in terms of thinking about open source software itself, so you heard twice this morning this study from the Harvard Business School. These are the authors of that study, and you heard the numbers of about $4 billion in terms of producing open source, but nearly $9 trillion in terms of value. One thing I don't think we heard this morning was the authors of the study also pointed out that it reduced the production cost by a factor of 3.5. So if we did not have open source, we would spend nearly 4 times more in producing that kind of software. So I think that's a very important point in terms of open source software as economic activity, as innovation, as participation, and so on. And the question is, can we get that with AI? Whatever you want to call it, the magic, the sort of the impact of open source software. Can we also have that for open source AI? I'm a firm believer that if we do that in a more open way, we increase the probability of doing that. I'm not saying we assure it or guarantee it, but I'm fairly confident if we don't do it in an open way, we reduce the probability of making sure that that happens. So the next one is openness as a design principle. So my research area is digital infrastructure. And if you think about the development of the internet and the web, there's two characteristics that I've observed or written about. One is that there was this triad or triple helix of universities, government, and industry. And if you move towards AI, the balance between those three has shifted considerably towards industry. Right? And people have heard me say that and say, oh, you're anti-capitalist, you're anti-industry. I don't mean it in that way at all. I simply mean that it is, again, it's an observation that that imbalance has certain implications, and that we ought to think about whether those implications matter in terms of how we get the kind of innovation and the kind of participation I was talking about. And the other is that those open protocols, TCP/IP and HTTP, allowed so many people to participate in the development of those technologies that ultimately became infrastructure. So when the open source AI definition came out, there were several organizations that either endorsed it or supported it. And this is a fragment of the blog post from the Mozilla Foundation. And I highlighted that one line there that says, it's marking a critical juncture in the evolution of the internet. So I'm not necessarily the right person to comment on whether that's true or not. I certainly respect their opinion. I do believe that last line completely, that it's about shaping the future of this technology's impact on society. But I think what they were hearkening to was that comment I made about TCP/IP or HTTP, right? If you have some sort of open protocol, whatever that means, in the context of AI, we have the potential to build something like the internet or the web as public infrastructure for all, right? So some of you may know, heard of his name, Peter Thiel in the United States, has said, we need more monopolies. He's public about this. I would submit that all the innovation that's happened in the United States has been called public infrastructure. It didn't necessarily start out as public infrastructure. Think about the railroads. I live in the city of Baltimore. The person who founded the university I used to work for, Johns Hopkins, made a lot of money in the private railroads. But as soon as we wanted to build a national railroad network, so we could get goods from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, we had a national railroad gauge. And we decided this is a public good, this is public infrastructure that needs to be built to move around goods, to move around people, to do all those types of things. The third one is this idea of broader participation and the open infrastructure that I just described. And you may find it ironic to see DeepSeek on this slide. And mind you, I didn't get my slides in exactly on time, but I did get them in, I think, a day before they were due. And I'm not joking. I literally sent the slides, and then Claire said something about the Open Euro LLM model right after that. So maybe I could have swapped the slide time if I was a little bit later. But I also don't know enough about the Open Euro LLM, to be honest, at this point, to make this kind of point. So just to be clear, DeepSeek, the OSI has noted that DeepSeek is not open source AI by the definition. So I'm just going to be clear about that. And my understanding it has to do with lack of training data being available or detailed information about it, and the code not being built. So just to be clear about that. What I will say is that DeepSeek has opened up a lot of interesting conversations around AI, especially compared to the large, well-funded big tech AI being developed in the United States. And there's a couple of people, including one of the fellows for AI, someone named Michelle Fang, who leads the policy group at Cerebras, who wrote a piece, an op-ed piece that basically said, this isn't about US versus China, this is about closed versus open. And the question is, what type of AI infrastructure do we build on? Right? So people have rightly pointed out to me, I don't know, DeepSeek's claims may not be precisely what they're saying in terms of the cost and so on. And I said, are you able to examine that? And they said, yes. And I said, okay, are you able to examine that with OpenAI? Are you able to examine that with Google? So the fact that we can potentially ask more questions of DeepSeek, in my view, is a feature, not a bug. Right? The fact that we can say, did it really cost $6 million to build? and ask those questions is incredibly important, right? And it's not just the cost to build it, and I don't know that somebody's mentioned this yet. The tokens are significantly cheaper to use, right, on a per token basis. So when you think about that Harvard study about the reduced cost of production, that's somewhat what we're seeing with DeepSeek, right? And whether it ultimately ends up being open source AI, or we get an open source AI version of it, my understanding is Hugging Face is leading an effort to sort of reverse engineer their code with help from the technical paper that they wrote. And they did very clever things at the inferencing layer, right, that have been talked about. There are researchers at Carnegie Mellon that have talked about this, but they actually did it. And one, at least, theory, if you want to call it that, is because they didn't have access to the best chips from NVIDIA, that expression you may have heard, invention, necessity is the mother of invention. They had to do something more optimized because they couldn't use the code. I'll give you a very strange example or metaphor. When I was in graduate school, I'm old enough that I had an account that had fake money attached to it, right? So as I did my things, I would see the money levels go down. And when it went into the negative, what I knew was as soon as I logged on, I'd be locked out until it refreshed to the positive. So Friday nights, I didn't have a very active social life. So Friday nights, I would sit there in front of the terminal, do as many things as I could, run it in batch, come back Monday morning, and see, because my account would be back in the positive, and then see what the results were. You can bet I optimized my code. I didn't just throw stuff out there and say, who cares? I'm going into my account for 2 weeks. I honestly wonder if that's what we're seeing here, right? We have very large funded, AI infrastructure funded companies in the US who may have just said, I don't need to get into the inferencing layer. I have enough, I have infinite money. I'll just keep throwing money at this problem. It's teasing out lots of interesting questions about what it means to have open infrastructure and participation. So this addressing of market failures. So I talked about conscience, right? So this is a small group that's been formed that is doing this AI-based drug discovery. And they're working with big pharmaceutical companies who are open and saying, we understand this category of drugs may be useful, but the profit is just not there. So Conscious basically said, all right, what if we help build a public data set that everyone can use to run AI models against? And then we will provide a benchmarking and evaluation framework for those AI models and the outputs that come out. And that idea gained so much traction that Big Pharma actually contributed to it. They actually contributed some of the data and actually some of the costs. So this is actually a really interesting case of where open science can be an enabler in the sort of last mile problem where the market doesn't have a good incentive to do this. So we're now seeing if you're open about the data, publicly available. I know that can't be true in every case, but then you also have these models being run in a competition or whatever you want to call it. Some of you may be familiar with TREC, which used to be a competition for natural language processing and information retrieval. It feels something like that. And then have the companies themselves participate after all that is done. It is a way in which openness can actually foster economic activity and engagement with the private sector. So the last one I will talk about is engagement with the global south, or as some people are not calling it, the global majority. I don't know if you've seen that map that somebody drew a circle basically around South Asia and China, and said there are more people in this circle than outside of it. So we are talking about the global majority. And this is a model that was just released by Carnegie Mellon. It has not been reviewed by the OSI, but they do provide their training data. They provide their training checkpoints. So not just the weight at the end, but at every step of the tuning, the code, and a technical paper that explains all of it. So my hope is that it will be considered open source AI by OSI, but even if it isn't, you can still go to the GitHub repo and get all that information now and read their technical paper. It is a multilingual, multimodal LLM that was built. It's highly performant. The paper points out that other than ChatGPT 01 model, it is better than any of the commercial models for doing language translation. And a big part of what they did across these 39 languages was think about context. So it wasn't enough just to have the data, right? So the one example they give in one of their papers is you get a picture of the dock, and when I had the last model to explain it, in English it said, It's a dock by the seaside where the sun is shining and there's boats and so on and so on. And you ask for a Japanese translation and it said, dock. Sure, that is a strict translation of that picture, but clearly we're not capturing all the context and nuances of what it means, not just in a strictly literal type of sense. So they really focused very hard on not only providing the data, but understanding how the data need to be curated and how that context is important to make the model perform in a more proficient way. So I will also note, I don't want this session to turn into like meta bashing, but I will say that Meta has a multilingual, multimodal model as well. They actually put a Creative Commons license, not even an OSI license on the code, that has a non-commercial condition on it. So they will work with communities, maybe that have languages that are not represented well, or maybe universally disappearing. And if those communities actually ever wanted to try and make a business out of them, they can't. So juxtapose those two stories in terms of which one of these do you think will have better participation, better inclusion, dare I use that word, better economic activity, right? So I think we are seeing real world examples right now where open source AI, open source and open source AI makes a real big difference. So I did say there would be 5 examples. I gave you 5. If you have some, I'd love to hear about them. Just end with some acknowledgments for the people who are doing their work. And I think we have time for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Does anyone want to raise their hand?
Really interesting and fantastic kind of view of what's happening within the landscape, but particularly just on that last point. Have you seen where others are starting to look at the models, particularly now where I said they're completely outsourcing your question of one of the trends we see within, I suppose, within industry is that trust in the model and where it comes from. I think as companies start to leverage that more on their internal data, that becomes more of a more important now. So have you started doing any work in those areas with an industry just yet, or is that be part of the research that you can see going down the road on that side?
Yeah, so I think Karen said that in the US we let things happen, then we regulate. That's if we regulate. So we have a few large technology companies who have basically said the only way you can build an AI model is large amounts of data acquired in whatever way, large amounts of compute, and so on and so on. I don't know that those companies planned to do this, but I believe what they've done is built the infrastructure on which we can all build small language models and application layer tools and so on. And I think that's where a lot of actually the innovation and economic activity will come. And that's not just me. I mentioned that I've had exposure, I guess I'll put it that way, to the venture finance world. There are people in the venture finance community in the United States who are openly saying, we've put a lot of money into your company and we're not seeing the return. It's not just the return, it's that our money's tied up in your company. So there's a very serious opportunity cost about all the other things we didn't invest in. One of them said that they literally had a question about a quantum company, I can't remember the name, it starts with an R, Rigati or something like that. And that stock went up 1,000% last year. So they are missing out on some very big opportunities because of this. My sense is that these companies now are a bit of a dilemma, right? So DeepSeek comes along, does some interesting things. There are open models like Pangea. People are building more specifically tailored AI use cases, or addressing specifically tailored AI use cases and so on. And say you develop one of these models and we look at it and it has some safety issues, right? But then when we look at your model, we conclude it's not yours. It's the underlying foundational model that you used. So what do? Just say, okay, too bad, it's unsafe. Use it at your own risk. I think we're actually going to get a very strange pathway into these models as more and more people build on them. as more and more competition comes, right? So, as I said, DeepSeek, there's lots of interesting questions to ask. I've pointed out, not only can you do that with DeepSeek, you should be doing that with any model you use, right? So I think that we are really at this interesting inflection point right now, and how, not just the US, but how we choose to think about this is critical in terms of these questions. The other point that, I'm not the only one who's made this, is imagine if we hadn't done that with the internet and the web. What if we had multiple internets? What would that have meant? We may not have even got the web, quite frankly. So I think these are interesting things.
Thanks, Sayeed. Anyone else?
So, just with the Pangea model, so obviously you have sort of standards that are assigned to it. Is there like a security kind of trust standard that's attached to it as well? I'm just thinking, obviously, governments though we translate everything into languages. For our language, not trained used for that model. I know it might be translating sensitive documents. So I'm just wondering if that trust piece has been done on things like Pangea.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is no, right? So to be fair to this group, this is a research team that worked on this and wanted to prove whether something like this could be done. And I think they've done a very compelling job of making that case. They did put this out on GitHub, they put a paper out there. When I contacted, it was actually the postdoc who worked on this, I said, do you mind if I highlight this? Do you mind if we consider it a technical prototype that is being developed under OFAI? He said, oh, that's great. Then I know there's some conversation around technology transfer and so on. So I asked two questions. I said, did you disclose this to the technology transfer office? He said, no, why would I do that? So we had a conversation about that. But the second conversation was, he said, look, I have a very good friend who's a radiologist. He's building a company with AI in healthcare and radiology, imaging, and so on. Have you considered that this could be really useful for medical situations, right? When people aren't necessarily native English speakers and so on. He said, no, we didn't really think about that. So I don't know if you went to the earlier talk I gave, but I think this is the role that open source program offices can and should play, is this is awesome research. Great, congratulations. Hopefully you get cited a whole lot, you get a great job as a faculty member somewhere and so on. There are these real world kinds of implications, possibilities, opportunities. We need to think about safety, we need to think about responsibility, security, and so on. I don't necessarily think it's the researchers that have to do that, right? So I don't expect them to have to do it, but if they say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, there needs to be a resource that helps them make that migration. So if you heard the briefs, like going from that project to the product, is that the change I was much thinking of again.
One back here, and then another one.
You have some great examples there of people doing interesting projects to keep smaller languages alive, and other people doing good work and sharing their AI models, but in a non-commercial way. And it seems a lot of good work being done, but then it's somehow being kept separate, through bad choices sometimes. And I wonder, do you see any way to merge these efforts? Something like, is there a community growing up on Hugging Face that's kind of separate to all the discussions that we're having? Or are we missing where the community is forming? Or do you have any suggestions for how we can help the community to work together on these things?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I do think Hugging Face is a very interesting place where there is community being built and a lot of these conversations are happening. I also go back in time to sort of the origins of open source. Right? We had these same similar types of issues in the early days, right? We did not have software foundations, we did not have codes of conduct, we didn't have any of those types of things. So I think that those things will have to evolve and be formed, if you will, around AI. To me, there isn't a logical one organization or one resource or one node that should make that happen, because these are very early days. Right? And I do think the EU AI Act can play an important role in sort of setting benchmarks, if you will, around things like what is acceptable risk and so on and so on. There has been a call by one of the organizations funding the Open Forum for AI, the Minyard Network is calling for some international philanthropy-based organization to do this work. When I talk about government, industry, and the academic sectors coming together for the internet and the web. The reality is the role of philanthropy is also grown in that time, right? In the United States, there's an enormous amount of money in private philanthropy, for private equity, and so on. So I think it needs to be an organization that has that kind of global scale, has that kind of funding, which, I'm trying to make fun of say this, is immune from changes in political climate. But I also, no disrespect intended, worry about an economy standards organization, which moves at a very different speed than AI, right? So we have to find some way to harmonize on that Venn diagram.
Great talk. I attended both of them. My software company helps our B2B clients publish, share, and track AI-generated content. We're about 4 years in. So I just want to give you a real-world example and then get your take on one of the problems that we've got. So our clients are fintechs and banks and regulated companies, and it's taken a long time for them to get comfortable with the cloud, would you believe, for putting content in the cloud. So they're comfortable with Google Cloud. And they're comfortable with Vertex because that's Google where the data book gets it. And so we now have them using that, and it's great. But they're really uncomfortable as soon as I mention OpenAI. So what I've learned today actually is the language that OpenAI means better transparency and open governance. But that message isn't landing with the CIOs or the folk that we're talking to. And I know there's lots of open source readiness councils and governance within these firms. But I'd love to get your thoughts on cost won't be the issue with these firms. These firms of security and scale and privacy and so. But I'd just like to get your thoughts, if you wouldn't mind revisiting your thoughts on open governance and open transparency.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to the comment Bill had made, and I believe John had made actually, that the hyperscalers are all using open source, and that if you want to have trust in the system, it has to be open governance, right? And I still can't get out of my mind the dating metaphor for how we build trust. But I'll use it. So imagine you're on a date with someone and you ask, some questions, and they say, well, I can't really tell you that. And here's a form you need to sign before I tell you where I grew up. Tone, it sets a certain expectation. And I literally have conversations in the US where someone will tell me, I need a vendor because I need someone's neck to choke if there's something that goes wrong, right? If that is your risk management model, then there are consequences to adopting that model, right? And you may be able to file a successful lawsuit, but you may not be able to scale, you may not be able to be transparent, you may not be able to meet regulation, and so on and so on. If your trust model is much more about, by being open, by having a community that understands what it means to be open, a governance model, not some free-for-all, that guides what those norms or expectations are supposed to be. We have evidence now that can scale to large cloud companies and large technology companies, universities, and so on. So I don't presume to tell your clients how to think about that, but I think those are some things that they might want to consider.
Okay, guys. Thank you so much, Sayeed, and thank you, everyone. We're just going to take a